We did a lot of research for this series, including watching a lot of documentaries about that experience. And there's no shortage of documentaries about the camps. And yet, when we watched this, we felt like we were discovering a brand new story that we didn't really know about. Can you say a little bit about why you wanted to intervene in how we talk about the camps the way that you did with this film?
Yeah, I guess, from the beginning, when I became a documentary filmmaker, I was interested in resistance, in just not how people are just victimized in, with wartime detention, surveillance, incarceration regimes, but how they resist, despite how little rights they have to begin with, when you're talking about immigrant populations. And so I just felt this, it was really at the tail end, this documentary really grew out of my other documentary, Enemy Alien. I mean, I was really thinking about this film before I even finished that one, because one of the challenges in Enemy Alien, which was a story about getting a Palestinian activist out of detention, and it was told from my point of view, good one, told from my point of view as a Japanese American whose grandparents were incarcerated, and getting into the history of the wartime incarceration. There was kind of a disconnect between my grandparents, who just basically went along with the program and raised a family inside the camp, and my mother was born there, and they just made the best of everything, which was kind of the overall story you tend to hear generally, the dominant narrative. And someone like Farouk, who led hunger strikes and organized other detainees, and helped fight his legal case, and and suffered immensely, beatings and solitary confinement. So it was such different experiences that I really wanted to find a link. And so the link, when I looked back at the history, was Tule Lake, which I had only dimly been aware of before. But once I learned about it and got, a hold of material that was available about it, it just really blew my mind that this happened, and that it was just so unknown. It's just such a massive thing, 12,000 people in this militarized camp, where they just made the rest of the camps look kind of, nice by comparison, So that's what really consumed me, and so I was working on that. I was using the flights out to screen Enemy Alien to shoot interviews for this one, because I felt time was of the essence, because people were in their 80s and 90s who had any, real specific kind of adult memories of what happened and who went through these things. So that's how it began.
And it's part of that master narrative that we often get of those experiences that generation didn't want to talk about what happened. And yet you found interviewees who seemed very, very willing to speak about kind of and how angry they were. And we also see that in the short film that precedes Enemy Alien, coming up later. What was it like to try to get them to tell those stories? Was it difficult?
Well, this particular group of subjects was not as challenging as, if I had just sort of tried to look people up. They were kind of people who were already in the pool of people who were willing to talk about them. Many of them had been on pilgrimages. I did try to reach out to some people who had told their stories before, and but some of them didn't want to tell that. Yeah, I did come across some people who didn't want to participate, so that was disappointing. But for the most part, people I knew were ready. Some of them hadn't told it before. Some of them were hesitant. Junichi Yamamoto, he had been interviewed once before, but he was suffering from some pain and things, and so it was a little tricky getting a hold of him. But and then Jean Tanaka, who has the last words of the film, and is kind of really, makes the ending happen in a sense. She thought she had nothing to say. Like, she was like, "Well, I don't know why you want to interview me. Nothing happened. I don't have anything to tell you." And it's like, oh my God. And I had to really make a commitment, because she was in Spokane, after when I was in Seattle, so I had to take a plane out there. So I was like, oh, I hope she has something to say, because I think she should have something to say, but she's just telling me she doesn't, So, yeah, and that was one of those little ventures you take, those little risks you take that pay off.
And amazing ending with her having to repeat to herself that she loves this country.
Yeah, it's like, to me, that's sort of, there's a real kind of ambivalence there. I don't know if she feels it or not, but I think many of us watching feel that there's sort of a question mark there.
And you mentioned that through your research, you found that Tule Lake was so unlike the other camps, and you portrayed that on screen really well. I mean, I saw images in here that I didn't normally associate with the camps. I mean, it looked like it was militarized. What was it like finding those kind of that kind of archival material?
Yeah, it was because the ones that show anything, resembling abuse were, I think those were mostly photos that were taken somehow. I don't know who was standing there with a camera when these things were happening, but they must have been smuggled out. Like the ones in the prison were somehow taken and smuggled out. So, there's a whole story there of who took these pictures, which I guess we'll probably never know. But, and it was a similar, I mean, that's another thing that comes up in Enemy Alien, because somehow, whenever these things happen, when you have this national security apparatus that springs up and this whole kind of mindset of the government, the worst things that happen are also, the more terrible they are, the more layers of unaccountability the government seems to have, and the harder it is to get any kind of image or any kind of documentation of them. And that was true of, that was part of the struggle of the story of Enemy Alien, which had to be a first-person documentary, because a lot of it is my experience of just trying to tell this story. Because when someone's in immigration detention, you can't just walk up and talk to them. The government doesn't want you to talk to them, so they'll do everything they can to make it difficult for you. And then also to get any images of anything to look at. You can't just have someone talk in a film. You need to look at stuff. And so, my struggle to get images of the places where Farouk was, and then which resulted in my footage being confiscated and the arrest. So that became a point of fascination for me. Just the idea of these pictures that were, because you actually weren't allowed to have cameras in the camps. So the fact that there's any pictures at all is sort of an act of resistance, because many people just kind of brought these cameras in and they took them, and I think they sort of got away with it because most of these were innocuous family pictures. But as you see, some of them took pictures that were subversive in the sense that they showed the truth of what was happening that the government didn't want people to know about.
Questions from the audience?
I was kind of surprised at how the ACLU seems like so impotent almost in this case. And they did a little bit there at one point, but they really could have brought this thing up into light. What's your opinion of that?
Yeah, well, that's another part of the story which I couldn't really get into, but the guy Wayne Merrill Collins, had a pretty thorough explanation of that. He talked about the liberal establishment, the East Coast liberal establishment, which had certain ideals. But they really didn't put any force behind doing anything about what was going on. It was basically, because they were very cozy with the Washington establishment, so there was very real limitations to what could happen. So it basically was Ernest Bessig who took it on, and then ultimately it was Wayne Collins, just really on his own. I think he was formerly with the ACLU, but he kind of went rogue in a sense because he just didn't have the support to do what he believed in. And so yeah, that's a thing that Wayne Merrill Collins has very thoroughly fleshed out political consciousness, and he had plenty to say about that. So yeah, it's quite true, and obviously you can see a lot of echoes of that today, with our political parties, and not to fault but of course these organizations all do great work, but there's many limitations that happen politically when you're talking about the money and influence.
I think your film really showed a very good example of how the government, our government, or any government, can be so subversive and divisive of turning people against your common citizen. It's just like, and people go along with it. That's what's so sad about everything. So it's just excellent film.
Yeah, I mean, Sasukina's analysis of that is very, very powerful. Just the divide and conquer strategy, and through, it's hard to say exactly what was deliberate and not deliberate, and just incompetent, but the action certainly exacerbated the tensions in the community.
I saw it has a very interesting view of how the historic part, how they live their lives with when people were, when Japanese were prisoners, and they had to how they live their lives relating to the events in the political field at the time. Like FDR signing the treaties and all that. Any international relation related?
Yeah, well, I know a bit about that. I didn't really take that on as a part of the film, but the diplomatic situation is very interesting. I mean, they had the Spanish consul representing the people in the stockade. Like, he was the one who had to come over and negotiate on their behalf, because I guess it was a neutral country. But when you talk about, there's a whole really prequel to this whole story. I really didn't want to start the film with Pearl Harbor, because really the seeds of the story go much earlier than that. And there's a very interesting book by a scholar named Eiichiro Azuma, I think, called Between Two Empires. And he gives a very detailed picture of how Japan was trying to influence the Japanese American community and this broader Nikkei community. It's just very fascinating, and really tells a lot about what happened eventually with the Kibeis. But again, I couldn't really get into that. But it's a very important story, which I hope to try to address, or someone should address someday. But there was a real game being played with how, between the United States and Japan, with how they were, with the Japanese Americans, and where they fit into this whole, two-nation conflict.
So I'm speaking from the context of a current university student and extremely interested and trying to engage myself more in this idea of resistance. I was wondering how you would suggest youth groups, activist groups, continue to engage and get others to be engaged in resistance towards equally oppressive acts and historical points that should be recognized.
Many of you have the tools already. You probably don't. You probably know a lot of things which I don't know about, as far as models of resistance. I mean, I guess what I noticed in these films was that, it also comes up in Enemy Alien, is that for real change you have to also be aware of the legal framework. So that's why I try to always give an understanding of what the legal framework of what's happening is. But there's also consciousness building, and obviously, showing up and protesting. But there also has to be some work to have an understanding of the tools that are being used to accomplish one objective, like an executive order. Because when you have because the way the big breakthroughs happen were through legal action. So I think even though we can't all become lawyers, we can be aware of what really is the tipping point as far as changing something that we care about. So I think these things like social activism and working with legal organizations and just solidarity with different communities are all things we have to keep aware of at any one time. So with these films, I hope to have outreach and do more outreach to Muslim communities, like I did with my last film. I've just been following these the Asian American festivals, but I want to do more, like I did with the Enemy Alien film, to also build that solidarity. So those are just things, I guess, the kind of three-pointed strategy that I think is helpful.
The Koshidan movement, which you show in the film, was really huge at Tule, like involving thousands of people. It also created an atmosphere of terror in the camp. I noticed in your film you decided, if I'm correct, to downplay that a little bit in terms of the terror aspect. And I'm wondering why you did that. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, there was a choice. I mean, there was a couple of, that was downplayed a lot. There was a whole issue of violence. It would have been good to try to cope with that in a story like this. I didn't have the materials. People had experienced it firsthand. So I wanted to be responsible about what I was going to say about the violence. Because certainly there was violence. The question of who was doing the violence was a little bit harder to get to the bottom of. There was a lot of different factions. This is a very confusing environment. I really didn't think that Tokyo Yamane was directing people to be physically attacked. And his account of what happened with this going to the warehouse to try to take care of the situation where some people were going to attack some government employees. That's what he said happened. And there were people who were beaten, there were people who were killed in the camp. It just was a whole other subject, which I didn't encounter anyone who had firsthand knowledge of it. So I would have had to build a whole just talky archival, chunk of film just to explain that whole thing. But it is an important question, and it should be addressed. But it's very complicated because, when you have these groups, there certainly were violent gangster types in there, and probably some of them were connected with the Hoshidan groups. But there was different. Hoshidan is just actually not a real name. It's just sort of a catch-all name. But there's these different organizations. There's like at least 4 of them that changed their names at various times. Like a lot like the extremist groups you talk about now. I wouldn't portray them as the same as an extremist group, but they had a lot of the same kind of tendencies and probably the same, sociological reasons for existing. So yeah, that's a good question, and it's just that's my explanation for why it wasn't dealt with in the film. And hopefully someday it will be treated responsibly and thoroughly.
Konrad's going to be back for the next film, which is Enemy Alien, which he's talked about already, which is in many ways kind of a sequel.
Well, it's
even
a
though it's been
precursor,
before,
yeah.
to this one, and then we'll have another short film. And then we'll end the day with a screening of Cats of Mirikitani, which is a documentary about Jimmy Mirikitani, who was in Tule Lake. So definitely check that out if you haven't seen it before. And we also have some of Jimmy's artwork outside that we have for sale. So thank you all for being here, and hope to see you at more screenings.